When billionaire Ethan Cole walked into his mansion at 2 a.m., he never expected to find this. His maid, curled up on the cold marble floor, cradling his baby boy as if her life depended on it. She wasn't family. She wasn't even supposed to be in the nursery at night. But what he saw next would break his heart and change their lives forever cold. That's the first thing Ethan Cole noticed as he stepped into his marble floor hallway at 2 a.m. The chill from the polished stone seeped up through his shoes. But that wasn't what made him stop in his tracks. It was the sight before him. At first, he thought the shape on the floor was just a pile of laundry left by one of the staff. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light spilling from the nursery, he realized it was a person, a woman. She was curled up on her side, a thin, faded blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Her head rested on one bent arm, while her other arm curved protectively toward the small crib beside her. The crib wasn't empty. Inside, his infant son, Liam, lay on his back, his tiny hand resting against the wooden slats, as if reaching for her. The woman was Clara, the new maid he had hired only a month ago. She was supposed to be sleeping in her own quarters on the other side of the house, not lying on the hard marble floor outside the nursery. Ethan stood frozen, one hand still resting on the frame of the doorway. His life didn't usually allow for surprises, not in business, not in his carefully ordered home. But this was not something he had ever expected to see. His gaze dropped to the details. The way Clara's breathing was slow and even, the way her hand rested near Liam as though she had been keeping guard, the faint traces of exhaustion etched into her face. Even in sleep, her expression was gentle. Ethan shifted his weight, the quiet sound of his shoes on marble echoing faintly. Clara didn't stir. For a long moment, he just stood there, unsure why he couldn't turn away. He was a man used to making quick, ruthless decisions. He was the CEO of one of the largest real estate companies in the city, a man whose calendar was booked months in advance, who solved multi-million-dollar problems before lunch. But right now, in the quiet of his mansion, he found himself hesitating. The truth was, he didn't often visit Liam's nursery at night. Not because he didn't care, but because he had convinced himself that his presence wasn't necessary. After his wife, Emily, passed away when Liam was only a few months old, Ethan had thrown himself into his work. Providing was how he knew to love. Money for the best doctors, the best nannies, the safest home. He believed that was enough. But tonight, seeing his maid lie on the floor, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the cold, watching over Liam as if he were her own, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:07 a.m. She must have been here for hours. Ethan took a cautious step closer. The light from the hallway cast a pale glow over the room, making Liam's soft features visible. The boy's small chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. His lips parted slightly in peaceful sleep. But then Ethan noticed something else. The faint redness around Liam's nose, the small bottle of children's medicine on the side table, and a used tissue crumple beside it. The baby had been sick. That explained why Clara was here. She hadn't just fallen asleep in the wrong place. She had stayed because Liam needed her. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. He remembered briefly a night years ago when Emily had fallen asleep beside Liam's crib, her hand resting inside as if to reassure him she was still there. Back then, Ethan had smiled and told her she was spoiling the boy. She had only laughed and said, "Some things are worth spoiling." The memory cut deeper than he expected. Quietly, Ethan stepped forward until he was standing just above Clara. Up close, he could see the frayed edges of the blanket, the worn fabric of her clothes. She wasn't dressed for comfort. She had clearly just finished her chores before deciding to sit with Liam. The hard marble couldn't have been easy to sleep on, but she didn't look uncomfortable. She looked at peace. Ethan noticed her hand again, resting near Liam's crib. It was a small thing, but the way her fingers curled toward him even in sleep made something in his chest twist. Without really thinking about it, Ethan bent down slightly and picked up the blanket where it had slipped off her shoulder. He draped it back over her carefully, making sure not to wake her. He almost walked away then. Almost. But his feet stayed rooted to the floor. He didn't want to break the stillness of the moment. The mansion was usually a place of silence. Sterile, polished, and echoing with emptiness. But here, in this little corner, there was warmth, not from the expensive heating system or the fine decor, but from a simple act of care. Ethan glanced between Clara and Liam again. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at his son the way she did, not as a duty, not as an obligation, but with genuine affection. He wondered what it must be like for her, working in a house this big, for a man who hardly spoke unless it was about business, caring for a child that wasn't hers. She had no reason to do more than what her job required, and yet she had. Something stirred inside him, a mix of gratitude, guilt, and something else he didn't want to name. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan took a slow step back, careful not to wake either of them. His hand lingered on the doorframe for a moment before he quietly turned and walked down the hallway. But even as he left, the image stayed with him. Clara on the floor, guarding his son through the night. And deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Months later, the transformation was complete. The mansion, once cold and hollow, now felt alive. There were toys scattered in the living room, framed photos of Liam's milestones lining the walls, and a warmth in the air that no amount of wealth could buy. Clara was no longer just the maid. She was Liam's second parent in every way that mattered, and Ethan made sure she knew it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan called Clara into the garden. Liam was running in circles, chasing the leaves that fell from the trees, giggling in a way only a toddler can. Ethan handed Clara a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "Open it," he said. Inside was a neatly folded document, her new role in the household. It wasn't housekeeper. It wasn't nanny. It was guardian. Ethan had made it official. If anything ever happened to him, Clara would have full custody of Liam. No questions, no legal battles, just security, love, and the life they'd built together. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he said softly. She laughed through her tears. "You couldn't get rid of me if you tried." That night, after Liam had been tucked in, Ethan stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Clara read him a bedtime story. She had one arm around the little boy, her voice low and soothing. It struck him then. This wasn't just a favor she had done for him that night months ago when she slept on the cold floor to keep Liam safe. This was who she was. This was family. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. Sometimes, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most. Clara didn't just care for Liam. She saved both of them from a life without love. And Ethan learned that the richest thing he could ever have wasn't his bank account. It was in the laughter and love inside his own home. The days that followed Ethan's offer didn't just bring changes. They brought an entirely different rhythm to the mansion. Gone was the constant silence of echoing halls and the cold efficiency of a place that ran like a business. Now there was life, there was warmth, and there was laughter, real laughter. Clara woke each morning not to the sound of alarms or chores calling her name, but to the gentle babble of Liam over the baby monitor. She no longer crept quietly to his room, so as not to disturb anyone. Now, she walked in with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Good morning, sunshine," she would whisper, lifting him into her arms. And every time, without fail, his little hands would reach for her face, as though to make sure she was still real. Ethan noticed the changes, too, not just in Liam, but in himself. The business calls that once consumed his mornings now started later. He found himself lingering in the kitchen for breakfast instead of rushing out the door. One morning, Clara caught him trying to make pancakes for Liam. The batter was too thick, the shapes lopsided, but Liam clapped as though his father had made a masterpiece. "Not bad for a billionaire," Clara teased, and Ethan laughed. A sound she realized she had only heard a handful of times before all this began. Afternoons became their shared sanctuary. On sunny days, they would take Liam to the garden, where he'd toddle on the grass, while Clara and Ethan sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching him discover the world one blade of grass at a time. Ethan began asking Clara about her life, where she grew up, what her dreams had been before life had thrown her into survival mode. At first, she kept her answers short. She wasn't used to someone like him caring about someone like her. But as the days passed, she found herself telling more. She told him about her mother, who had worked herself to the bone to raise her and her siblings, about the small apartment they'd shared, filled with second-hand furniture, but rich in love, and about the promise she'd made to herself, that no child in her care would ever feel unloved or unwanted. Ethan listened, really listened, and sometimes he shared pieces of himself too, about how his marriage had been a business partnership more than a romance, how fatherhood had scared him at first, and how losing his wife had left him feeling like a stranger in his own home. It wasn't just talk, though. There were small, wordless moments that began to matter most. Like the evening Clara found Ethan on the nursery floor, not working on his laptop, but stacking blocks with Liam, or the rainy Saturday when they all sat under a blanket on the couch, watching cartoons, Liam curled between them like he'd always been there. Somewhere along the way, Clara stopped calling him Mr. Cole. And somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped thinking of her as the maid. But with comfort came a quiet fear that neither of them spoke aloud. For Clara, it was a fear that this was temporary, that one day she'd be told her place in this house had ended, and she'd have to walk away from the little boy who had wrapped himself around her heart. For Ethan, it was a fear that he wasn't worthy of the family they were building, that his past neglect had already cost him too much, and no amount of effort could erase that. Yet, somehow, without addressing those fears directly, they both kept showing up every day, building something fragile but real. One night, after Liam had fallen asleep, Ethan found Clara sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. "You're still up?" he asked quietly. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I was thinking about everything." He sat down across from her. "Good things, I hope?" She smiled faintly. "Mostly. I never thought I'd end up here, in a place like this, with people like—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's strange. It feels like home. And I haven't felt that in a long time." Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Then let's make sure it stays that way," he said simply. From that night on, it wasn't just a mansion that had changed. It was them. Liam had a father who was present. Clara had a place where she was wanted, not just needed. And Ethan, he finally had a reason to believe that his life could be more than boardrooms and contracts. They were, in every unconventional sense, becoming a family. And deep down, all three of them knew they didn't want it any other way. It had been 2 weeks since that night Ethan had found Clara asleep on the nursery floor. 2 weeks of small but noticeable changes. Him being home more often, actually eating meals with his son, and even joining in bedtime routines. But tonight felt different. The air was quieter, heavier somehow, as if the house itself knew something important was about to happen. Clara was in the kitchen, stacking clean dishes into the cupboard. Liam was already asleep, and the gentle hum of the baby monitor sat on the counter beside her. Ethan walked in, his footsteps unusually slow, almost hesitant. Clara glanced over her shoulder. "Evening, Mr. Cole," she said politely, going back to her task. "Clara," Ethan began, then paused, running a hand through his hair. "Can we talk?" Her hands froze midair, holding a plate. In her experience, when a boss said, "Can we talk?" it usually meant trouble. "Of course," she said carefully, setting the plate down. "Is something wrong?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat down, leaning forward slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've been watching you these past few weeks." Clara's stomach tightened. That didn't sound good. "And I've realized—" Ethan's gaze dropped for a moment before meeting hers again. "You've been giving my son something I didn't even know he was missing." Clara frowned slightly. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You're doing far more than your job. You're mothering him." The word hit Clara like a punch. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and shook her head. "I would never try to replace." "I know," Ethan interrupted gently. "You're not trying to replace anyone, but you've been giving him love, patience, presence. And because of you, I've started to see what kind of father I should be." Clara didn't know what to say. She stared at him, her hands twisting the edge of the dish towel she was holding. "I don't want you to be just a maid anymore," Ethan continued. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ethan took a deep breath, "I want you to stay in this house, not as staff, but as part of this family. I want you to be Liam's full-time caregiver and his godmother, if you'll accept it." The room went silent, except for the faint buzz of the fridge. Clara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she found her voice. "Mr. Cole, that's not something you just offer lightly." "Why me? There must be—" "Because I trust you." Ethan cut in, his tone steady. "Because I've seen the way he lights up when you walk into a room. Because when I was too busy chasing meetings, you were the one making sure my son felt safe and loved." And he hesitated, his voice growing rougher. "Because I owe you more than I can say." Clara swallowed hard, blinking back sudden tears. She had worked for families before, wealthy families, powerful families, but no one had ever looked at her the way Ethan was looking at her now. Still, a shadow of doubt crossed her face. "But people will talk. They'll say you're—" "They can say whatever they want," Ethan interrupted again, his jaw tightening. "My son's happiness is worth more than gossip." Her throat felt tight. She thought of her own life, how she had come to this job out of necessity, how she had no family nearby, how she had never imagined herself becoming so attached to one little boy. And yet, the idea of walking away now felt impossible. Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "You'd have your own room here, your own salary, more than you make now. But more importantly, you'd have the freedom to raise him with the same love you've been giving him since day one. I don't want you to think of yourself as help. I want you to think of yourself as home for him." Clara's breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her before. She looked down at her hands, blinking rapidly. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Cole." "I know," Ethan said simply, "but I want to." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock on the wall. Finally, Clara let out a shaky laugh, half from relief and half from disbelief. "Well, if you're sure you can handle both me and a toddler under the same roof." Ethan smiled, a real, warm smile she'd rarely seen from him. "I think I can manage." And so, that night, Clara didn't just walk back to her small maid's room down the hall. She walked to the nursery, looked down at the sleeping baby she loved like her own, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, little one." From the doorway, Ethan watched her, feeling, for the first time in years, that maybe, just maybe, this big, empty house was finally starting to feel like a home. Ethan Cole wasn't a man who changed his schedule for anyone. For years, his life had been dictated by back-to-back meetings, working lunches, late-night negotiations, and constant phone calls. His assistant once joked that he'd cancel his own birthday before he canceled a client meeting. But the morning after he found Clara asleep on the nursery floor, something unexpected happened. He canceled 2 meetings. His assistant, Michael, nearly dropped his tablet when Ethan told him, "Sir, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Ethan said shortly, buttoning the cuffs of his shirt. "I just need to spend the day at home." Michael hesitated, but didn't argue. After all, Ethan Cole was the boss. If he wanted to move $1 million deal to watch the paint dry, no one could stop him. But Ethan wasn't planning to watch paint dry. He wanted to watch something else. Someone else. By mid-morning, he was in the nursery, leaning quietly against the doorframe, watching Clara with Liam. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, blocks scattered around her, as Liam clumsily tried to stack them. Every time one fell, Clara laughed softly and encouraged him to try again. There was no rush in her voice, no hint of impatience. She treated every failed attempt like a small adventure instead of a mistake. When Liam finally managed to stack 3 blocks without them toppling over, Clara clapped her hands in exaggerated celebration. Liam's little face lit up, his giggle filling the room. Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest. He realized, painfully, that he had never heard his son laugh like that before. Not for him. Later, Clara sat in a rocking chair with Liam in her arms, feeding him a bottle. She hummed quietly, a tune Ethan didn't recognize. The boy's small hands played with the edge of her sleeve as he drank, his eyes half closed in contentment. Ethan stayed in the doorway longer than he intended, unable to look away. It struck him that Clara never seemed distracted when she was with Liam. She wasn't thinking about her phone or rushing to finish a chore. She was present, completely. It was such a simple thing, and yet it was something Ethan had failed to give his son. At lunch, Ethan surprised the kitchen staff by joining them in the informal dining room instead of eating alone in his office. Clara was there too, feeding Liam mashed sweet potatoes in his high chair. "You can't just give him the spoon," Clara explained when Ethan offered to try. "He'll use it as a catapult, and you'll be wearing lunch." Ethan smirked. "Noted." Liam, as if on cue, reached for the spoon and promptly flung a blob of orange puree onto Ethan's shirt. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, trying to hide her laugh. Ethan looked down at the mess and laughed too, a real, unguarded laugh that felt strange in his own ears. That afternoon, Ethan took his phone into the study, ready to catch up on emails, but he didn't open them. Instead, he found himself staring at a photo on his desk, a framed picture of Emily holding Liam as a newborn. Her hair was messy, her eyes tired, but the joy on her face was unmistakable. Ethan's mind wandered back to something she used to say. "You don't raise a child with money, Ethan. You raise them with moments." He had ignored that advice for so long. But now, watching Clara with Liam, he could see exactly what she meant. The real turning point came that evening. Clara was in the nursery again, reading aloud from a colorful picture book. Liam sat on her lap, chewing on one corner of the book while she pretended to scold him gently. Ethan stepped inside, and Clara looked up in surprise. "Oh, did you need something, sir?" "No," he said simply. "I just thought I could read to him." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she smiled and handed him the book. Ethan sat down on the edge of the rocking chair, holding the book awkwardly. He started reading, his voice a little stiff at first. But when Liam looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, something shifted. Ethan's voice softened, and he found himself leaning into the story, even adding silly voices for characters. By the time the book ended, Liam was giggling again, his small hands reaching toward Ethan's face. The sound made Ethan's heart ache and swell at the same time. That night, after Clara put Liam to bed, Ethan stayed behind in the nursery. He pulled up a small chair beside the crib and just sat there, listening to the quiet breathing of his son. He realized that for the first time in months, he didn't feel the urge to check his phone, to send another email, to review another contract. He felt at peace, and he knew exactly why. It was because Clara had shown him, without saying a word, what being a father really meant. By the end of the week, Ethan's assistant was in shock again. "Sir, you blocked out your afternoons?" Michael asked, double-checking the schedule. "Yes," Ethan replied, straightening his tie. Ethan glanced toward the nursery door, where Clara's voice could be heard singing softly. "Family time." Michael stared at him for a moment, then wisely decided not to comment. Ethan had changed, and though he didn't say it out loud, he knew exactly who to thank for it. Morning sunlight streamed through the high windows of the mansion, spilling golden light across the polished floors. The house was quiet, except for the faint clinking of dishes coming from the kitchen. Clara stood at the counter, making a bottle of formula for Liam. Her eyes were heavy, and her movements a little slower than usual. She hadn't slept properly in days, not since Liam's cough started. She was thinking about whether she should call the pediatrician when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She froze. The steps were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of the other staff. She turned, and there he was, Ethan Cole, leaning casually against the doorframe, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. His presence filled the room in an instant. "Morning," he said, his voice calm, unreadable. Clara swallowed, unsure of how much he had seen last night, or if he even knew. "Good morning, sir," she murmured, her eyes darting briefly to the bottle in her hand. She was about to turn back to her work when he spoke again. "You slept on the nursery floor." The words landed like a stone in the air. Clara froze mid-motion, the bottle still in her hand. Her mind raced. Was he angry? Did she cross a line? Was she about to be fired? I'm sorry, she began, her voice small. Liam was sick, and I didn't want to leave him alone. I must have fallen asleep without meaning to. Ethan set his coffee cup down on the counter, the soft clink sounding far louder in the silence. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. Why? Clara blinked. Why what? Why didn't you put him in the crib and go to your room? Why sit there all night? She hesitated. The honest answer sat in her chest, heavy and uncomfortable, but she forced herself to speak. Because sometimes a baby doesn't just need a bed. They need someone there, someone who won't leave, even if it's uncomfortable. Her voice was soft, but there was no hesitation in it. She meant every word. Ethan studied her for a long moment. His face gave nothing away, but inside, her answer hit harder than she could have guessed. No one in his world ever chose discomfort if they could afford comfort. People left when things got hard. They always did. And here was this woman, barely a month in his employ, who had chosen the cold marble floor over her own bed simply so his son wouldn't be alone while sick. Clara shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the bottle. I understand if I broke some sort of rule, sir, she added quickly. It won't happen again. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. That's not what I'm concerned about. She looked up at him, surprised. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. Most people who work for me do exactly what's in their job description. Nothing more, nothing less. You, he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. You're different. Clara wasn't sure what to say to that. He's just a baby, she finally whispered. And babies need more than food and clean clothes. They need someone to make them feel safe. If it were my little sister, I'd want someone to do the same for her. Her voice trembled slightly on that last part, though she tried to hide it. Ethan's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in thought. There was something about the way she said it, the quiet conviction behind her words, that made him realize this wasn't about duty or obligation. It was about choice. You remind me of someone, he said suddenly. Clara tilted her head, curious but not daring to ask who. My wife, Ethan added after a pause. She used to say the same thing you just did. That presence is more important than anything you can buy. The air between them grew heavier, charged with unspoken memories. Clara lowered her gaze. I'm sorry for your loss, sir. He gave a short nod, then picked up his coffee again. Don't apologize. Just keep doing what you're doing. Her eyes snapped up in surprise. You mean I'm not in trouble? Ethan allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch his lips. If anything, you're the only one in this house who's not. With that, he turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Clara stood there for a long moment, still holding the bottle in her hands, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew something had shifted. The man who had barely acknowledged her existence was now looking at her differently, like she wasn't just a maid, but someone who mattered. And for the first time since she arrived, Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, she belonged here. Ethan Cole had seen a lot in his life. Boardrooms full of ruthless investors, contracts worth hundreds of millions, skyscrapers rising from the ground because he willed them into existence. But nothing in his world of power and precision had prepared him for the sight of his maid, Clara, asleep on the cold marble floor, guarding his son like a soldier on watch. He had stopped in the doorway at first, frozen. He told himself to move on, to keep walking, but his feet didn't obey. Instead, he studied her. Her head rested against the wall, strands of hair falling loosely across her face. The thin blanket she had wrapped around her was hardly enough against the chill that even he could feel in the air. Her knees were drawn up slightly, one arm curled near her chest while the other rested on the floor, fingers almost brushing Liam's crib. Then his gaze shifted to his son. Liam's breathing was slow, steady, but there was a faint redness around his nose. His tiny chest rose and fell with a soft wheeze now and then. Beside him, a small bottle of infant medicine sat on the table, the cap slightly crooked, next to a damp cloth and a used tissue. The pieces connected instantly. Liam had been sick. Clara had been here for him, and she had stayed. Ethan's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something else, something unfamiliar. For months, he had convinced himself that the way he cared for his son, providing the best doctors, the safest home, the highest paid staff, was enough. He told himself that love could be measured in stability, in security, in making sure Liam never wanted for anything material. But now, in the dim glow of the nursery light, he saw something his wealth couldn't buy. It was in the way Clara's body curled toward the crib, even in sleep, as if some instinct told her she needed to be close. It was in the faint lines of exhaustion on her face, the kind that came from caring more than you had to. It was in the fact that she hadn't chosen comfort, hadn't gone back to her room, hadn't even grabbed a pillow, but had simply stayed. Ethan stepped forward quietly, his shoes making the faintest tap against the marble. Clara didn't stir. Liam gave a soft sigh and shifted, his small hand brushing against the wooden crib bars, as though searching for reassurance. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. It was a strange sensation, almost like guilt but heavier, warmer. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he had been the one to stay by Liam's side through the night. Maybe never. He crouched slightly, reaching for the blanket that had slipped down Clara's shoulder. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it back over her, making sure it covered her properly. For a man who spent his days making decisions in seconds, his movements were almost hesitant, as though afraid to disturb the moment. He straightened again and stayed there, staring at the two of them, Clara and Liam, one by blood, one by circumstance. And yet, in this moment, they looked like they belonged to each other. Ethan thought about Emily, his late wife, and how she used to insist on being the one to rock Liam to sleep, even after long, exhausting days. She had once told him, "Babies don't remember the toys you buy them, Ethan. They remember the arms that held them." Back then, he had smiled and let her have her way, telling himself he was too busy to be the one holding the baby. Now, standing here, he wished he had listened. The air in the nursery felt different, warmer somehow, softer, despite the cold floors and the stillness of the night. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was in a mansion. He felt like he was in a home, and that feeling had nothing to do with him. It was Clara. She wasn't just doing her job. She wasn't just the help. She had crossed an invisible line, one he hadn't even realized existed, into something deeper. She cared for Liam in a way Ethan hadn't seen from anyone, not even from professional nannies he had hired. A question formed in his mind, one he couldn't quite shake. Why? Why would someone who had no obligation beyond a paycheck give so much of herself? Why would she choose discomfort, exhaustion, and the risk of breaking boundaries in this house just to stay near his son? Ethan didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't a moment he could ignore. He stayed a little longer, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely, not in judgment, but in quiet observation. The hum of the central heating filled the silence, mixing with the soft breaths of the two sleeping figures before him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned to leave, but as he stepped out of the nursery, he caught one last glimpse of Clara shifting slightly in her sleep, her fingers brushing the crib again as if to reassure herself that Liam was still there. That image burned into his mind. Ethan didn't know it yet, but tonight had planted a seed of change, a realization that maybe, just maybe, money wasn't the most valuable thing he could give his son. Clara didn't come to this house looking for kindness. She came for survival. At 27, she had already lived a life that would have crushed most people twice her age. Growing up in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Clara learned early that the world didn't give second chances. Her mother had died when she was 16. Her father had disappeared long before that. And her younger sister, her only living family, was still trying to finish school back home. Clara had been working since she was a teenager, cleaning houses, washing dishes in cramped restaurants, sometimes working 2 jobs at once. She sent every extra dollar to her sister, so she could stay in school and not have to take the same road Clara had. When she saw the advertisement for a live-in maid at a billionaire's mansion, she almost didn't apply. People like Ethan Cole didn't hire people like her. But she went anyway, wearing her only nice dress and clutching a printed resume that fit on half a page. She still remembered the interview. Ethan hadn't spoken much. He had left most of the questions to his assistant. He looked at her briefly, his dark eyes unreadable, before saying she'll do and walking away. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but the job came with room, board, and a salary she could only dream of. She said yes instantly. From the first day, Clara understood her role. Keep the house spotless, follow instructions, and stay invisible. Ethan's mansion was enormous, a place where the walls seemed too far apart and the rooms too big to feel human. She learned the routines quickly, dusting the endless bookshelves, polishing silver that probably hadn't been used in years, and arranging fresh flowers in vases that cost more than she'd made in her last job. But the real surprise was Liam. The baby was quiet, too quiet. Clara noticed that he rarely cried, and when he did, it wasn't the loud, demanding wail most babies had. His cries were soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure anyone would come. The first time she held him, it was because the nanny had stepped out to take a phone call. Liam had been in his crib, staring up at the ceiling with wide, empty eyes. Clara leaned over and said softly, "Hey there, little man." His eyes shifted to hers, curious. She picked him up without thinking, supporting his small head in the crook of her arm. He weighed so little it startled her. From then on, she couldn't help herself. She made excuses to check on him, bringing fresh blankets, tidying the nursery, or pretending to adjust the curtains just so she could see him. When she learned from the other staff that Ethan's wife had died, it all made sense. This child had lost his mother, and his father, though he clearly provided for him, wasn't around much. Clara began doing small things that weren't in her job description. She sang to Liam when she cleaned his room. She made silly faces to coax a smile. She read aloud from children's books she found on the shelves, even though he was too young to understand the words. At first, Liam just watched her quietly, but over time, his eyes started to follow her around the room. The first time he reached for her finger, her heart nearly broke. Then came the night he got sick. It started with a cough, soft at first, then harsher as the evening went on. By midnight, Liam was restless, tossing his crib and whimpering. Clara tried everything, patting his back, humming to him, changing his position, but he kept coughing. She found a bottle of infant medicine in the cabinet and gave him the dose listed on the label, then stayed by his side, making sure he didn't get worse. Hours passed. The other staff were asleep, and Ethan was out at a business meeting. Clara didn't even think about leaving. She sat on the floor beside his crib, her hand gently rubbing his back whenever he stirred. At one point, Liam's small hand slipped through the crib's bars and rested on her arm. She froze, not wanting to wake him, but the gesture made her eyes sting. This baby, who had every material thing he could ever need, still craved something no amount of money could buy: presents. Clara shifted against the wall, pulling the thin blanket she had brought from her room over her shoulders. She hadn't planned to fall asleep, but exhaustion eventually took over. The last thing she remembered was the sound of Liam's breathing finally slowing into peaceful rhythm. She had no idea that, just hours later, Ethan Cole would come home and see her there. No idea that this one night, this one quiet act of care, would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever.